Hello and welcome to Worst Quality Crab, a podcast of Asian American stories and recipes from best quality hearts. I'm your host, Freesia Lee. Joining me as always is Sam.
Hello.
And our very special guest today is Haeny Yoon, professor at Teachers College and host of the Pop and Play podcast, a show about the intersection of play, pop culture, and identity. Welcome, Haeny.
Thank you for having me. It's so good to be here.
We are very excited to have you.
I too am very excited.
Yay, great. I love that you also have a show about identity.
Yeah, I was just telling you earlier that I felt like this podcast, when I listened to some of the episodes, it just resonated because I think pop culture is the way that I enter, but at the end of the day, I just want to find out about people.
Yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
I know we tell people that we have like a food show, but it's really just a guise for who are you? What's your life like? What?
Exactly.
How did you move through the world?
Yes, exactly. And it's like a lot easier to do it by asking something like that, like, what are you watching versus tell me about your childhood trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. Which we also sometimes get into.
Yes. Us too.
Yes. Great. Listeners, you should go check out her show. It's really great, especially parents. I'll just put that out there.
Aw, thank you.
Had some very helpful moments listening.
Aw, thanks.
Yeah. But Haeny, we're here to talk about food. Tell us, what dish have you brought today that reminds you of childhood? Where were you eating it? Who was making it?
Okay, so the dish that I'm going to talk about is this thing called Sujebi, which is this Korean street food. It's easy. It's not a gourmet sort of thing. And I was actually intimidated by this question to begin with because I'm sort of like, I did not grow up in a food recipe place. Like I listened to, I think one of your former guests talking about a recipe book that was passed down to her. And I'm like, oh my God, that is not my family. We do not do that. There's barely any thought to the food that was made.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Chicago. I was actually born in Korea, but I came when I was like 2.5 to Chicago.
Okay.
So yeah, so I grew up there. My parents still live there. My brother's family is still there. And I'm the one that's in New York.
Okay. Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Chicago, like suburb or in Chicago?
We started in Chicago, like the city. So it's this place called Uptown. And it's like West Chicago, I want to say. It was like a big immigrant community back in the day.
Okay.
So that's where we started. And then like every good immigrant family, we graduated more and more out into the suburbs and more deeper into the suburbs.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we kind of moved into an adjacent suburb and of Chicago, like the closest one, and lived there for a little while. And then we moved to like the northwest suburbs of Chicago.
Okay.
Which means you've actually made it. But I think when I think about food, I think a lot about my dad. Because I think my dad was more the inventive cook or adventurous cook in our family than my mom was. My mom, I think, cooked to survive. And so she made us things because she knew we were supposed to eat meat. She knew we were supposed to eat like some vegetables. Everything was rice. But I think my dad was more like, I think he's more a nostalgic cook actually. So a lot of the things that he experimented and tried out had to do with Korean street food. And Sujebi, I don't know if it's necessarily classified as Korean street food, but it's basically like a soupy thing. And you just take flour and water and you just like try to make it into like little shreds of, it's not really hand-pulled noodles. Let's be real. It's not that sophisticated, but it's basically you just take flour and water and you just shape it into like something that looks like a flat, just torn piece of flour. And then you have zucchini and potatoes. And sometimes if you get really fancy, you could put eggs and scallions or something. And so you just like kind of make like a anchovy-ish sort of broth. And then you just throw all these things in there and just let it simmer into a soup. And it's just basically that's it.
Oh, yeah.
And so, yeah. And I just like, I don't remember when I got introduced to it. I want to say it was sort of like in middle school. So there was a point where my mom was working at night. So my parents both worked at the post office. My dad was a letter carrier. And then my mom worked at the desk, but then before she worked at the front desk, she used to work at nights, like sorting mail. And so she would work at nights and she would sleep during the day. And there'd be some times where my dad would finish his shift being a mailman, like a little bit early. So he would come and just make us these random things, and like Sujebi was one of them. Like he would make us this omurice thing. He would make us like tteokbokki, like just like different things that I felt like I actually really liked because it kind of suit my palate for some reason as a kid. And so I think I recall those moments that my dad cooked for us as something that was sort of like he got home from work early and made us something special and different.
Yeah.
I also like knew how to make 3 things in college, and this was one of them. And so I remember making this unsophisticated soup thing, but I also had like Asian roommates. And so what I would do, I would like taught people how to make sujebi.
That's awesome.
Makeshift version of it. And so I remember one of my roommates actually really liked it. And so she would make it herself too. So I'd like to say the reverberations passed on.
Yeah. Was this ever a restaurant dish? Is this just like super homemade?
No, I think they do have them in restaurants. Yeah, they do have them in restaurants.
Oh.
Not all of them, though. It's definitely more like a low tier Korean food. So I've actually seen, okay, I take that back. I did have a version of sujebi at this Korean place that I went to in New York City that is more like, it's a fancier version of sujebi. So it's like that, but it has like lobster tails or something in it. Like, I don't know. I'm making that up, but it's something like that. So I definitely see versions of it, but it's definitely not something that's available everywhere because it's really just like simple, almost like quote unquote peasant foodish.
I like that.
Did you learn how to make it by just watching your dad?
Yeah, I watched my dad, but I think at some point he kind of taught me how to do it. So he's definitely like a teacher. He likes to teach us how to do things. And 90% of the time it was annoying. But then every now and then I was like, I kind of like this, so I want to learn how to make it.
That's awesome. You mentioned like making it after school. Was this going to become like a dinner for the whole family, or was this kind of like kids only in front of the TV?
Yeah, no, very good question. Okay, because it's got to be dinner. I mean, it's pretty filling. It's like the equivalent of like gnocchi, I guess, right, for Korean people. And there's potatoes in there. And then there's like eggs and zucchini. And I'm just like, how could you actually eat something after that? But what's weird about it is that after school, I always ate something. So I remember coming home from school. I don't know why. They must not feed kids enough at school or something because you're like starving by the time you get home. I don't know if you guys remember that, but I just felt like I never felt full when I got home. I was hungry.
It's because we had champion metabolisms back then and had to like move all day long.
Yes. I long for those days.
Sometimes I forget about that. And then when our kids get home and they're like angry for no reason, it was like, why are you so angry? It's like, oh yeah, you're probably starving.
You're hungry. Exactly. And so I would eat ramen with like rice cakes and like all this stuff in it. I would eat like, my running joke with my husband is that I would eat those Salisbury TV dinners like Hungry Man. So I would eat that, but then I would also eat dinner. So I can't remember if this was a snack or if it's dinner, but for those people that are listening, it should be dinner. It is not a snack.
Unless you're in middle school or in high school, in which case you need 3 dinners anyway.
Yes, exactly. So yeah. So I think it should be dinner. I think sometimes I do remember these things being dinner. Like my dad would make dinner. But I also feel like there are sometimes when those same dinners would be snack.
That's kind of how it works in our house some days. Have you made this recently or as an adult?
Oh my God, I haven't. I actually thought about this in preparation for this. I was like, when is the last time I made it? And I want to say like, it was definitely in my 20s when I made it last. I think as you get older, I don't know. I feel like there's so many things that are quintessentially Asian that get just like a raw deal in media, right? Like carbohydrates. Nobody wants to eat carbs anymore. So you should not eat any rice, or you should eat like 1 spoonful of rice or something just absurd, right? So on top of that, this thing had potatoes in it. So it's just like double whammy carbs and like all the gluten known to man. Right? So I feel like at some point I kind of just started to subscribe to that a little bit, where it just was like, I have to limit my carbs. I have to limit this. I have to limit that.
Mhm.
And I am going to make it though, like in the next 2 weeks, because I know I'm going to try to send you guys a photo of it.
Oh yeah, we would
when I
love
do
it. I mean, we're going to try to make it after this also, because I'm very curious. That's such an interesting thing you bring up. And we touched on it in another show, and I think I touched on it, about these like sort of diet culture or wellness culture that are really unfairly maligning a lot of cultural foods.
Yeah, for sure.
And wellness just being so sort of like white centered, and rice is bad and tofu is bad, and all of these
Yeah.
things that like Asian cultures have subsisted on for countless generations. And
Right.
just now, like, oh no, it's off limits.
hmm Yeah, yeah. I even think about something like MSG, right? It's such a bad word, but I feel like it's just salt. Okay.
Yes. It's delicious.
Exactly.
Yeah, I guess what just came up for me too in thinking about that is when you talk about identity, and if we're thinking about like these things that don't feel good to us anymore, and we started to sort of like keep them out, at what point do we like stop identifying with them? Or we have this question around like, how do I identify with my cultural foods? And then, what does that make for us with kids? Like, how do we then sort of pass that on to our kids, and how do they identify to cultural foods if we've all been sort of impacted by this quote unquote wellness culture that is just low key racist?
Right, right. Exactly. Just conditioned to think of it as one way.
When you were growing up, did you ever feel any of this tension of Korean foods versus, more sort of traditional American foods, or the Hungry Man dinners, or anything like that?
Yeah, I definitely did. I think because to this day, I think my mom and dad have a really hard time eating non-Korean food in general. So I feel like if you go like a whole day and they basically didn't have Korean food, I think it's like really hard and difficult.
Mhm.
And so that's what I grew up on, and I think other kids, like when they would talk about what they ate for Thanksgiving, let's say, okay, like because I don't even know if my mom knows how to make a turkey, honestly. Like I learned how to make a turkey when I was like 22 years old, and I don't even like it, honestly. I don't like turkey. I said it right here.
Yeah.
I hate it.
Yeah.
It's the worst.
Totally.
So our Thanksgiving was not like other people's Thanksgiving, but I would dread it because we'd have to come back from Thanksgiving break and everybody would just talk about like their Thanksgiving dinners.
Oh,
And I'm like,
yeah.
either I have two choices. I'll make things up, which I have done, or I'll just like say something random and know that people are going to be like, what the hell is wrong with that girl? So like, and so I think there's definitely a tension, and you're not supposed to eat kimchi, right? One of my friends actually told me this story about how her mom also worked at the post office. And her mom would not eat kimchi for the whole week. Any day that she feels like there's like a day, a plus or minus one day where she's going to be at work around white people. And then on the weekends when she wasn't working, she said that she would have this extreme personality where her mom would just like gorge on kimchi, like eat insane amounts of it. And it's just like funny how you accommodate, and now it's like interesting just to see, my husband Neil and I always joke about this, but now like Korean food is such a fad, right? Or like Chinese food is like something that it's like everybody loves it now and everybody loves to go eat sushi or whatever, and
Yeah.
it's become like so mainstream, but it wasn't like that when I was growing up.
Yeah.
So it was still weird.
Did you ever have a lunchbox moment? Were you taking like Korean lunches to school?
I never like actually took lunches to school. I think mostly I bought lunch and that was fine. But every now and then we would have to have a field trip. Everybody would have to bring like a brown bag lunch or something because there's no school lunch that day. Or you'd have to get those like white bag lunches that the school provides because you didn't bring lunch and then get shamed by everybody. That was worse. So my mom would pack lunch. Okay. And so this is where like the East meets West misunderstanding happened. So she would make me a sandwich, but she would toast the bread. Then she would have those Oscar Mayer bologna slices, Again, my mom was not the greatest cook. Okay. But I actually look back on this moment and think, wow, that was kind of ingenious. So she would fry the bologna, okay, and then put it into our sandwich. And then she would like fry an egg and put it on top of there and then just like fill it with like cheese and vegetables or whatever, tomato, whatever. And then I would open my sandwich that was in aluminum foil, right? Because everybody's is in like a plastic Ziploc or something. And so I would open it and I'd be like, oh my God, there is a fried piece of bologna and an egg in my sandwich, and now it's weird. So I think it's like that thing where I tried to be Americanized. I think my mom tried a little bit, but then there would be like that one thing in there that would just make it weird.
I have a bologna sandwich story from my childhood too.
Oh, I want to hear it. I want to hear it.
You do.
I think this was back in kindergarten, in first grade probably. And at home, my mom would make me random things, like some Americanized things, whatever. And it would be like, it was like white bread, Oscar Mayer bologna. And then like, I don't know if she didn't know what else to put on it, or maybe I requested it, but she would put like grape jelly on it too. So it would be like a bologna and grape jelly sandwich. And I would just eat it regularly at home. That was like my favorite thing when I was a kid. But like occasionally she would pack me that for lunch too. And I think one time in class I was eating it and some kid looked over and they were like, ew, is that like a bologna and jelly sandwich? And I was in a panic and I was just like, I totally gaslit them. I was like, no, this is just peanut butter that looks like bologna.
All that is peanut butter and bologna and better combo.
Oh, maybe.
Wait, I love that. I love that you gaslit your 5-year-old friend.
Yes.
5-year-olds are the best gaslighters, by the way.
I know. So true. So true.
And they were just like, oh, okay, whatever. Moving on.
Yeah. I mean, I think to your point that maybe your mom didn't know what to put on it, or maybe it was just like a guessing game sort of thing. Because I feel like that now. So I'm going to give away a family secret right now. But my parents are also, now that they're older, they're very health conscious, right? And so I think my mom just gathered information or intel on all the things that are healthy, like vegetables, spinach or something, or beets or avocado, blueberries, like all the things that are individually good for you. Okay. So she makes this breakfast sandwich that is in a spinach flavored tortilla. Okay. So it's not even spinach, it's spinach flavored tortilla. And then she puts like an egg on it and cheese, but then she puts like a piece of iceberg lettuce and then beets. Okay. And then it's on and then there's avocado on it. So it's like the weirdest thing ever. And then sometimes she replaces this spinach tortilla with an blueberry English muffin. Okay. So it's like a barely toasted, and that you're not supposed to toast it too much because all burned things are bad for you. It gives you cancer. So it's like a barely toasted blueberry English muffin with cheese and egg. And there's avocados and beets and a piece of iceberg lettuce. And my husband, Neil, always comes, he's like, whenever we go back and visit my parents, he's like, oh my God, are we going to have a weird breakfast sandwich? I was like, you know it.
Okay. I love all of this. And I just want to point out that if these were like $22 on a brunch menu,
Exactly.
right? Like it would, if some like aggressively tattooed white chef were like, haha, here is toasted bread, egg, bologna, vegetable, like salad, right? You'd be like, oh, yes.
Yeah.
And then
exactly.
if someone else were like, some other aggressively tattooed white chef were like, the bologna and this grape chutney, right? Instead of grape jelly. Compote, like a great compote. Yes, exactly.
Oh, yes,
right?
Yes. Yes, with some foam on top.
Exactly. Like all of these things on some other menu in some other context are like, ooh, is that genius?
Yeah.
Do I love it?
No, so true. So true.
So like your mom might be onto something. Maybe she should open up an overpriced sandwich shop.
Yes, exactly. And she'll put all the things on it for you. Everything.
That's amazing. I love that. You have mentioned that your mom is more of a functional cook
Mm-hmm. Yes.
than anything,
Uh-huh.
and that your dad is a little bit like more experimental.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like that played a part into like how you sort of grew into becoming a cook for yourself?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think to this day, the thing that, if someone asks me like what I want to eat, it's usually some kind of soupy noodle thing. So my husband Neil's like, what do you want to eat? I was like, well, I'm always going to say soupy noodle thing. And it's so interesting because my niece right now, she's 7. And we were all like trying to decide what we're going to eat for dinner when I was visiting them in Chicago, and we were throwing out some ideas. And she said, well, I will always accept noodles and soup. And I was like, oh my God, it's genetic.
Yeah.
It's hereditary. We just all love that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I think those are the things that I really committed to like trying to get down in the least amount of time possible. So like if I sat there and was like, what am I going to have for dinner? It's just going to be some kind of soupy noodle and it's going to be fast. I was going to figure out how to make it fast. And I think now there's just like so many things out there that took so long to make that become so easy to make now because, like even like an anchovy broth, right? Like you would have to take anchovies and onions and, you'd have to like let it simmer for a really long time. And now they just have like packets that you just throw in there for 10 minutes. So I was like, oh my God, this is genius, and it's like white people have been doing that all the time. They've been packaging a lot of things and you can make it so easily. And I was like, and now there's like an Asian version of that makes it very simple. And I don't think I realized that I was more of a functional cook until I met Neil. His family is more like, they just like really know how to cook stuff. And so I think when he's like introduced me to cooking, I think I was sort of like, oh, I guess I'm not that good at cooking. And I think, like I told you before, I think that's what I realized too as I got older and spent a lot more time with his family and his mom, for example. And I realized, oh, maybe my mom also was not that good. Because this is very different. There's like intention and technique and all of that happening right now in this room. And, Neil's mom would always ask me like, oh, she would make some kind of Korean dish because they're Chinese. And so, but his mom like basically cooks like every genre of food. And so she would make like some Korean dishes sometimes. And she would be like, oh, so how does your mom do it? I was like, no.
She doesn't.
Yeah. So it's funny. And so Neil is always like, well, they didn't grow up like that. So it's like, okay. And I think some of it is because my mom was like working at nights. She came to the States with like, there's nobody here and she's isolated and stressed. And, I don't think that was one of the things that she developed for obvious reasons.
Yeah. On another episode, we talked with Sam's sister and we finally came to discover that their mom, who is a prolific cook, also maybe didn't enjoy it and just sort of like learned to cook out of necessity and because their dad sort of required it.
Yeah.
But she, I guess we could say luxury, but like she had that space to do that because she wasn't working when they came here.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you bring up this really interesting point about immigrating to a new country, having little kids, and then going to work, and then like something kind of necessarily has to get lost in there.
Yeah.
Or get, kind of put on the back burner. Haha, bad pun. But it sounds like for your mom, cooking was it. And it's just like not something that was ever that important to her. Like she didn't really have a love for it, maybe.
Yeah. And I think now now that I'm an adult and it's just me and Neil, but like, we don't have kids, but like we have to come home and we're like, oh, so exhausting at work. We just like sit at our computers all day, and then we're like, what are we going to eat? And it's so hard. And then we're like, let's just order our Chinese food go-to. And that's basically what we do. And I realize it's really hard. It's a lot of things to think about.
Yeah.
So shout out to people who do it all the time and do it well. And I could see why they wouldn't like it.
Yeah. Right. I think, I've said this before on this podcast, but like nobody tells you how much you have to feed kids all of the time.
Yeah.
And it's just like, I just am so impressed too by like a lot of our generation's parents who didn't have DoorDash and couldn't just like pop some things in the microwave necessarily, or have all of these like prepackaged, pre-made parts that they could then quickly throw together. And were just like having to make things.
Yeah.
Or teach their kids how to, or kids fending for themselves or whatever. But just, 25, 35, 40 years ago, whatever, it was so different.
Yeah.
And it's kind of amazing.
Yeah. I mean, don't you feel like we were also pretty ingenious though in what we made?
Oh, yeah.
Back in the day? Like I would always make this chili mac thing. And it was basically like cans of Hormel chili that I would put on top of elbow macaroni. And then I would put like a ton of red pepper flakes in it. This was like when I was in 4th grade. I was like, I guess I really just like spicy things all the time. And I'm like, this is the best thing ever. And I'm sure if I eat it now, it'll be disgusting. But I think there were a lot of things that I kind of like learned how to make too that, I just had to do out of necessity.
Yeah. I think Sam has mentioned that he basically learned to cook because he was home by himself.
Yeah, me too.
At some points, and he was starving after school.
Yeah. And it was just like, it would range. Like sometimes I would make something. Sometimes I would go get a Kraft cheese slice and eat that.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah. Kraft singles.
Many a Kraft single unwrapped and called it a snack.
Yes, exactly.
Ritz crackers and Kraft singles.
Pretty ingenious.
Yeah. When you go home now, are your parents still cooking when you're visiting?
They are, but it's again like very simple sorts of things. And I think as my parents got older, I think their taste kind of went back to just like simple things, like a Sujebi aesthetic is what I would call it.
I love that.
Yeah. But they also go out to eat all the time. Like we always go out to like this Sundubu place all the time. We always, they still have their go-to. Like they'll go to this Sundubu place. Sometimes they'll go to this Japanese place, and then they'll go to this Chinese place. And it's like basically in rotation because my parents are just like, they have to have Asian food like 1 to 2 times a day.
Do your parents like cook for each other?
My mom cooks for my dad. Like my dad's health is not good right now. So he has a lot of mobility issues. So he's not able to do a lot of that stuff anymore. But a few years ago, like after he retired, he actually took this California roll making class, like a sushi class, I guess. And so he would make these like sushi rolls all the time for us.
Aww.
And that's what we would have during Thanksgiving. Yeah. So it kind of like reminds me of that. Like, so there would be like California rolls. There would be like some shrimp situation. Like none of it was raw. So I don't know what the nature of this class was, but it was like making rolls, I guess. And so he would do that a lot.
The nature of the class was less liability.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Don't consume raw fish if you're not a professional.
That sounds awesome. It sounds like your dad was a lot more interested in cooking and food in general.
Yeah, I think so. And I always feel like if he had more time, I think he would have developed it even more. I mean, I never thought his cooking was bad. I preferred my dad's cooking to my mom's, but I think my mom just ended up cooking more. And I think it could be Asian culture is less so, but more patriarchal, especially back then. It was still like there were these delineated roles of men and women. So my mom did cook more just out of what roles were at the time. But my dad was, I think, a much better cook.
Oh, God, that's so interesting about these delineated gender roles that kind of aren't serving if someone else is better at the thing.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I think that's so true. Like it makes logical sense. Like my sister-in-law works and my brother stays at home with the kids. And they did that because they sat there and talked about who actually liked their job and who didn't, who was going to be better at certain things, and stuff like that. And so that's how they ended up in the roles that they did. It was more out of like a discussion and figuring out like where our pursuits and passions are and then how we're going to support those things.
Yeah.
So
that's awesome. I love that for them. I love that for everybody out there.
Functional conversations.
Go have that conversation.
Yeah. Exactly. Yes.
Not things decided by just generations of someone else's idea of power.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
That's awesome. Does your brother cook? Does he fall under the functional cook the way that you do?
My brother, I don't know. I don't know what his favorite things to cook are. That's actually a really good question. I'm not sure. I think my sister-in-law is a good cook. She just doesn't have as much time to cook. So I think that the things that she makes, she actually does it really well because she only has like these very small pockets out of a really busy schedule to make something. And so I think she is intentional about what she's going to make. I also put her in the same category as my dad. Like if she had a lot more time to devote to cooking food rather than doing this job and taking care of 2 kids and doing all this stuff. And she's like very organized. So we rely on her to do like a lot of organization. So that's like the bad thing. It's like if you're really good at something, then people make you do it all the time.
Yes.
So the key is be really bad at it and then nobody asks you. And so she, I think, would cook a lot more if she had more time.
It's just interesting to me how, we've talked about this before, but 2 people growing up in the same household experience things very differently.
Yeah.
And that can either lead to like, very different outcomes and some siblings really wanting to like pick up the mantle and do things exactly or learn what they never got. Or some just being like, nope, that's also my style.
Yeah. I love looking at recipes. I love reading people's stories. Like I love just the idea of it. Like I was going back and I was following your Instagram and then I looked at some of the things that I saved and it's like all just food. It's like pictures of food everywhere. So there's something about that's really appealing to me. And I think I would say the same about my sister-in-law. Like we follow the same people. We talk about food all the time. She introduces me to things or places and then vice versa. So
What that sort of brought up for me was like, that feels like a massive privilege that a lot of immigrant parents, one, technology, right? Like they couldn't see what else was out there. And I say privilege in the best sense of like, we are now removed away from sort of like survival of things into a space where like we get to just dream about food and we get to think about like what would be fun to do and what's beyond what's functional and sort of utilitarian eating into this like dreamy food space.
Yeah, that is so true. I just wonder like what would my mom be doing if she was growing up in this age? I can imagine that so many families probably had a utilitarian way of eating.
Yeah. Or even like what sorts of cooks would they be? How would they parent?
Yeah.
What sort of food parents would they be in this age?
Right.
I'm thinking about that for my own family. Oh man, Sam, do you think your mom would do a lot more takeout if she were still cooking for you as kids?
Probably not.
Did your parents cook for you all the time?
Yeah, my mom pretty much cooked every night dinner.
Wow.
I think takeout was just very expensive.
Yep.
In general, just like if I could make all this stuff every night, like why would I spend money to get other food is probably what their mindset was when I was growing up.
Yeah, I don't remember ever getting takeout other than pizza. And that was every now and then. And I feel like we didn't go out to eat that much at all.
What was the Asian food scene like in Chicago when you were a kid? Not that you would know the food scene as a kid, but like...
The Asian food scene is pretty good there because there's so many Asians. I didn't feel like there was, like, we had to go very far to have Korean food. And so it must have been, like, very prevalent wherever I was. And there were a lot of Asians growing up. So, like, I compare my experience to Neil. Like, my husband Neil grew up in Michigan. He always says this, so I'm just going to quote him, where he says his mom grew up in the whitest town in America. And it's called Livonia, Michigan. And I guess it literally is the whitest name for the whitest town, I guess. Okay, so I'm just quoting him. So if I'm wrong, it's not, don't fact check me, don't at me.
At Neil, it's fine, at Neil.
Exactly. But, his experience was so different because I grew up with a lot of Asians around me all the time, and he grew up with no Asians around him all the time, so his experience of growing up Asian was so different. So
Neil's not on, I can't ask him, but as it relates to you and your relationship, do you feel like that has an impact on the way that you eat together?
We have different tastes in food, and I'm not sure if it's because we're different kinds of Asians or we grew up differently or because he likes things like meat and stuff like that. And I like meat, but not all the time. And so, so I think we definitely have different tastes. I think for him, it was sort of like this refreshing thing when we got together because he grew up around so many white people. And that's like how he developed his taste for food. And then to be with an Asian person and then realize that you could actually eat your Asian stuff together.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was like I think it was kind of a pivotal moment for him. So I
Yeah.
basically changed his life.
I mean, of course.
Of course.
Can he handle spicy food?
Yes, he can. He can handle spicy food, but he also is appalled at how spicy I eat my food. But so is everybody else. Everybody else is like, oh my God, you just like basically have no taste buds now.
I mean, you did hit the red pepper hard in 4th grade. I think that's pretty telling.
Yes. It's been a slow decline since then.
Just more and more heat to try to feel something.
Yes. He always tells me, he's like, you don't have to put a serrano pepper in everything. Because that's what I do. I even put in my salads. Like I just put them everywhere.
Oh, that's something.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in preparation of this, I actually re-listened to your introduction when you introduced the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, first, I have to watch the Joy Luck Club again because I'm like, oh my God, I'm like getting all teary-eyed just listening to Sam. This is why we've named it Worst Quality Crab. And it was like, I don't know. It was just like a really interesting thing. But I thought about the whole idea of just lifting up the everyday, right? It's not like this fancy recipe that people are coming with, but it's just something that you eat every day that's so simple that you even forget that it's anything strange or weird. And so I like thought about this. I think this is why I was looking back on my Instagram feed. New York Times, they started publishing these op docs every now and then, like an opinion documentary. And there was this one that was done by this filmmaker, Sean Wang. And he basically did this op doc that I highly recommend because it just like really brought me back. The question that he did was what I learned when I reopened my middle school yearbook. And it's basically like all these photos of middle school kids, and it was mostly Asian kids, and just like talking about like high school crushes and weird things that they did in middle school or pranks that they played on each other. And it was just like this documentary of things that they were just talking about, and this very old school visual aesthetic. And I think it was during the pandemic, I want to say, and I felt like it hit me so hard because it's like this idea that we can be Asian and just talk about everyday things, not have to relate it to some kind of political issue, not have to educate people on some kind of cultural, social thing. But here's just like how I move through my life every day. And here's something funny that happened. And this is like, it's like interesting to talk about. And I can present it in a way where people are interested, right? And I felt like growing up, the only time that people would be interested in me is if I could say something profound about being Asian, right? That's why I think most of us had to bring like dumplings to Multicultural Day or wear like our traditional dress or whatever. When you're like, I never wear this. This is just so weird. Like I'm just wearing this because you people expect me to wear this. Like I'm just bringing this food that I eat like every once in a while, like once in a blue moon, because you expect me to bring some kind of kimbap situation. You expect me to bring some dumpling situation.
Yeah.
So I think it's like the whole, like being able to talk just about your everyday life without putting so much weight on whatever you have to say. But that thing that you say can be so meaningful, right? And I think like recently I watched Joyride.
Oh,
did you watch Joyride?
Not yet. Probably this week.
Oh my God, it's amazing. It's hilarious. And so what I liked about it is I just like love the idea of just watching some messy Asians just being messy and not having to be like an example, not having to fit a stereotype, not having to do anything except just be their messy selves, and we get to laugh about it.
Yeah. I'm very excited to see that. And also, getting outside of mono minority. And, I think for me, it's different because I grew up in San Francisco where like there are so many Asians that I didn't necessarily feel the same sort of like white gaze. I'm not sure that's the term, but like it wasn't that necessarily. But I do still think that they're, even growing up here with so many other Asians and specifically Chinese, there's still a sense of like having to fit into whatever that looks like.
Yeah.
And for me, I didn't. I'm half white, so like I never fit into that.
Mm-hmm.
And, I said on a past episode, Sam's family is my idea of what like Chinese really looked like. And so I married it. But yeah, I mean, I think it's totally true. Just like being around other Asian people and being able to like talk without footnotes, right? Like you can just say a thing without having to contextualize it. You can talk about food without having to like explain what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the same time, I think for us too, like getting to know some dishes and even other Asian cultures that like we don't know as well, like having Filipino friends and like really learning about Filipino food a little bit more. That's been really interesting for us.
Yeah, when I met Neil and his family, because they're just such a different kind of Asian that I'm used to. Like when I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, like most of my friends came from like the community of church that we went to, right? Like that was like the main, like that's where you meet other Koreans or other Asians or whatever. And so I felt like I was always around the same kind of Asian experience. Like all our parents were immigrants. We all came here when we were like 2 years old, or we were born here, but our parents are Korean speaking mostly, so we had like a similar experience. And then I met Neil's family, right? So we're like driving to his house and I'm meeting his parents for the first time. And his mom calls him, and she is like speaking in this no accented English. Okay. And then she's like calling him sweetie and things like that. And I'm like, this is just some weird Asian stuff happening right here. Like I've never and it's different in San Francisco, right? You have generations of Asians, but that was like one of the first times that I actually heard an adult Asian speak without an accented English. Which is like so bizarre that I would even say this, but it's so true. Like, I'm like, it's so weird. I've like actually never met someone over the age of like 65 that didn't speak like accented English, and I was like, oh, I guess there are different kinds of Asians.
Yeah.
So, and I always make fun of him too about like, oh, you guys are basically white. And he's like, you gotta stop gatekeeping who gets to be Asian.
I mean, yes, I'm going to side with Neil on this one. But that's kind of like why we do this show and why it's so interesting for me, because like, I think in a lot of ways, even though it's very different in San Francisco and like, I'm kind of known a lot of different types of Asian, when I think about the Asian experience, even myself, even being whatever generation I am, I think about what you just described as your experience, right? Like I think of 1 or 2 generations removed from immigration, accented English.
Yeah.
Even though I don't come from that, I still think of that as being like the thing.
Yeah.
And just like wanting to also incorporate and I guess give platform and give visibility to Neil's experience, to other people's experiences where, like I think I would probably similarly have joked like, oh, you're basically white. And I've said that to other people. And like, it's all in good fun, listeners. Don't at us. We love our people. But just like wanting to create a space where like that is included in this like Asian experience and all under the umbrella. Because I think to your point earlier of just like, what does being Asian look like or is supposed to quote unquote look like? It looks so many different ways. And food looks so many different ways too, right? And so if Neil's mom is cooking all of the things and she's maybe like a prolific Italian cook or whatever they make in Michigan, I don't really know. But that like doesn't detract from his Asianness in any way. It just looks different than what, you and I are used to.
Exactly.
And the food stories around that too, right? Like it's not just kimchi and beef and broccoli or fried rice or whatever.
Yeah.
His Asian person eating food experience is, I don't know, they make cherry pies in Michigan. I do know that much. So maybe it's that.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. And like what you're saying makes me think of, Viet Thanh Nguyen talks about that narrative plenitude idea, where it's basically like white people get to have so many stories told about them that you're never like, oh, this is the white experience, because there's like hundreds of them and they're like on screen, they're in books, they're around you all the time. You see them in school. Like you don't see one typical kind of white person, but then like with people of color, like whether it's Asian, whether it's the Black experience or the Latinx experience, right? Like they all, like there is a story that we all know, right? Because that story is so prevalent everywhere.
Yes.
And I think he talks about how it's because there's like this economy of narrative scarcity, like where when a person of color has to put a story out there, you're so responsible for having to tell the story. Like this is your chance to tell the story of Korean Americans or Indian Americans or Chinese Americans or whatever it is, that you have to have like, there's like this burden because there isn't an import for these stories, right? Like you don't have that many chances to do that. And he's kind of talking about how there's got to be like this narrative plenitude part of it where you have plenty of stories. So then you get a complicated picture of what it means to be Asian.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Oh my God.
Yeah, I love it too. I mean, I like think about it all the time. And I think it just like speaks to me. And one of the reasons why he actually wrote that piece about narrative plenitude was he said he watched Crazy Rich Asians and he thought it was just whatever. And he was sort of like, but it's okay. Like, why can't it just be whatever? But it's almost like when someone makes an Asian thing, like you feel pressured to have to like it
and support it. And
exactly. Yes. And it has to be amazing because there isn't enough of them.
That's how we feel a little bit about Netflix's Bling Empire.
Oh God.
Where, like we want to support Asian faces on screen and also woof sometimes.
Okay, but don't hate me. I'm like obsessed with that show.
Oh no, I've watched every single episode. I will like binge it the day it drops. I'm with you.
I know. And Neil will come in when I'm watching it. He's like, what is this garbage? And then he's like there for 10 minutes. So I'm like, look, you just watched 10 minutes of it, kept complaining about how it's garbage.
Yeah.
I mean, is it trash? A little bit, yes.
Yes.
And I'm still going to watch it.
I mean, I'm still going to watch it. And I think like, I do appreciate that it is like not in the narrative of model minority and it's not in the narrative of an immigrant story. And is it wild sometimes and just the most ridiculous? Yes, absolutely. And like, I like that there's a place for that for like Asians to occupy that space.
Exactly. Because how many of those are around right now anyway? Like the Kardashians, like the Vanderpump Rules, like,
exactly.
I feel like there's so many.
There are so many white versions of that. I can't even name them all, right? But
exactly.
To get one, it's like, okay.
Exactly. And we never say that's the white experience. Like we just know that that's one experience.
Yes.
We deserve our own trash too.
Exactly. Exactly.
Oh, we do. We really do. I mean, yeah, that is why we do this show, right? Like there are any number of podcasts out there about food and experience. But I guess the thing that like always kind of struck me, and I'm maybe only now realizing this in the moment, is when people talk about Asian food and Asian recipes, a lot of times it's like the fancy thing or the big thing, or, it sounds very complicated. And I do just really like this idea of, we were eating things on a weeknight that were pretty simple and sometimes weren't Asian flavors in any way. But it's all, kind of under the umbrella, but not every night is like a Peking duck or beef and broccoli, or not everything is like Korean barbecue all of the time.
I know. It's like maybe people think we're having Korean barbecue all the time in our houses.
I mean, no, I'm absolutely sure that someone does.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking, I think I told you this story, Frisha, but I that was never my experience. Like we never had these fancy whatever. Like our fancy thing was going to like the all you can eat buffet, Chinese buffet, because there's crab legs there.
Yeah. Oh God.
Like
Yes.
that was our fancy dinner nights. And so I think I had this perception though that other Asians around me, and particularly like other Korean Americans, were having like more of a fancy dinner experience. Because when I was in college, that's like what everybody would talk about. They would talk about their own version of that Michelle Zahner Crying H Mart book, right? Like that their moms were these like prolific chefs that would make all this Korean stuff. And the whole routine was that during breaks, like I'll go home for winter break. Then we come back from winter break and everybody would bring like these ice boxes full of all this like panchan that their mom made them, right? And I was like, I would never come with that because there's no way my mom's making that. She might bought me boxes of choco pies. Okay, that's what my friends remind me of. And that's like what my experience was. And I think I just had this idea that everybody's mom, like in middle school and high school and elementary school, I was always worried about my parents being too Korean and like how they were going to Americanize everything we did. But then when I got to college and I was around like a lot of Asians, I was like, how come my mom is not making me all this Korean banchan and sending it home with me so I could show off to everybody? So it was just like, you can never win.
Yeah. Like not Korean enough.
Mm-hmm.
They're too Korean and then not Korean enough.
Exactly. Yeah. And I'm sure we've all experienced that at some point.
Oh yes. I mean, I feel like that is
you especially.
Yeah,
yes.
me especially. I'm like that is the line of like my autobiography. It's like when you were coming back from college with your choco pies and everyone else had all of their coolers full of banchan, what was that like for you? Just in terms of like feeling like you fit in or sort of your own relationship to your Asianness?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely makes you feel not enough. I think what you just said is that there's like this feeling of inadequacy that your experience didn't match the stellar experience that some of your peers had. And it's just so easy to play that game, over and over again and just to compare yourself. And I think I remember, Eric Kim, the New York Times chef, he wrote a cookbook called Korean American. And basically he mentions in there about how he doesn't necessarily subscribe to the idea of like Asian fusion or that it's like whatever. It's just like our version of this cuisine, right? So that there's this idea of like authenticity in the cooking world, right? Like this Chinese food is really bad because it's not authentic, right? Or this Korean food is not like it. This is not correct,
Yes.
So I think that happens everywhere, right? But he was saying like, it's not about that because everything is authentic. It's just authentic to that person, right? And like what their experience was growing up. And I think, there's so many examples of why people would struggle with that to begin with, right? And I think back to the choco pie banchan thing, right? Because now it seems like that person's parents were a lot more authentic to the Korean experience than my parents because my parents don't know how to do all those things, or because this person grew up in this set of conditions, like they are more authentic than I am. Or even like when I admitted that I would like police Neil's authenticness of the Asian experience, like I feel like it's like we're just like constantly trying to tell each other how authentic you are in this whatever. But if we kind of expand that a little bit, then I think there wouldn't be these conversations around authenticity, right? It's just like how you interpret or understand the experience.
Yeah. Well, and I think what comes up for me around that too is that the authenticity is almost relevant and relegated by white people.
Yeah. Right.
Right? Like if there was no like sort of white outside force to say like this is authentic, this isn't.
Right.
Would we be having these conversations?
Yeah. Right.
Because everything is relative to like proximity to whiteness. And so it seems less authentic because it's more Americanized. But if that weren't the case, and if like we didn't sort of live under that culture, could we just have conversations about like, this is how I was Korean in college and this is how you were and this is what it's like to be, half Chinese or whatever the case,
Yeah.
without it always being this relative to whiteness.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I mean, it is like we literally use the term Americanize it.
Yeah.
So
We've got a lot more to unpack here, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
another time.
Yeah, now we're all going to go to see a therapist right this second.
Yes.
And have some Korean food.
And have Korean food.
Yes.
Haeny, this has been super fun. We have talked about so much. I want to keep talking forever. I think we could unpack supremacy and food culture if we kept going. We'll save that for another day.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.
Yeah.
I love your podcast. I do.
Oh, thank you. And I love yours. Mutual adoration.
Oh, thank you.
Speaking of which, where can people find your podcast and find your work if they want to?
The Pop and Play Pod is on all the platforms wherever you subscribe to podcasts. So please subscribe. And then we also have a Pop and Play Pod account on Instagram, on Twitter, which will probably be dead. So see you on Threads. And then we also have a segment called the Trashy Awards that's on TikTok. And so that's also on Pop and Play Pod. And my colleague, Yoon Literat, actually runs that, and it's hilarious and delightful. So
that's amazing.
Please check it out.
Definitely. Anyway, this has been so great. Listeners at home, if you would like to make Sujebi for yourself, you can find a link in our show notes. And if you want to reach us, you can send us an email at worstqualitycrabpod@gmail.com, or find our website, Worst Quality Crab, or find us on Instagram at Worst Quality Crab. All the same things. Until next time, thank you all so much for being here, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.